It's wonderful to see you all in person, including our panelists. It's always nice when we get the chance to gather. And we've already had a fantastic conversation. Lisa will be joining us virtually. And I'd like to start by picking up on something that Ravi said. The challenges are immense, and I think he put it very accurately and very bluntly. We need more money, but I think we also have to make sure that money goes where it's most needed and is going to be the most effective, which is also part of the challenge. So as we kick off, Lisa, I'd like to begin with you. What can be done to incentivize green investment and mobilize money to fill this enormous funding gap that we still face, even with the commitments that have been made?
Thanks, Maggie. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to join you all here today. I think I should tell you that my bias is I'm a former politician in Canada. So therefore, I view these matters from a public policy point of view. The major thing we need to remember is the fact that the choice to go to green transition is a choice being made by governments around the world. Therefore, it's not a natural capital markets kind of deployment. So you need to have that assistance from governments. How each government's going to approach it is really going to be dependent upon the emissions challenge they have in their country. In Canada, for example, 28% of our emissions come from oil and gas production. In the United States, it's not so much. It's power and transportation. But at the same time, we always have to take a look at what's happening around the world from a competitive point of view. Knowing that governments must be involved, you also need to compete with other governments to make sure that capital decisions are happening in your own country. So with the Inflation Reduction Act having $369 billion worth of incentives for supply chains, for transition, Canada can only do what it can do. So it has two things that it must remember. Number one, whatever it is that they're going to try to incent with the public purse, it's going to have to help reduce our overall emissions, predominantly oil and gas. But secondly, we have to be competitive with the United States. As the senator said at the beginning, it's either meet us or beat us. And we certainly have taken up that challenge as best we can here with the resources that we have. But we have to be focused, and we have to make sure that we're ready for the reinvention of what supply chains are going to look like, and be focused as well on the sectors where we can make a change. So in order to attract the private capital that's going to be needed, governments really have to be picky and choosy and keeping in the backs of their minds and in the front of their planning what it is they're really trying to accomplish. And it's twofold. You want to reduce the emissions that have the most impact in your country in order to hit your Paris Agreement obligations. And number two, you want to make sure that you have an economy that's going to be transitioned as well and just not leaving people behind.
That's so interesting. Robin, I wonder if you could respond to that. Competition is healthy. Competition often spurs innovation. But it can also work against progress if you're all racing and sort of hoarding resources. And I think that we saw what happened during COVID when there was global cooperation and everyone united, the enormous progress that could be made quickly. So could you talk about a little bit about the tensions when we're talking about policy, trying to make sure countries remain competitive, but also we get the sort of momentum that we need in terms of mobilizing capital? How are you approaching this from a policy point of view?
Sure, yeah. This is a really interesting moment, actually, where I think we're still actively wrestling with this question. Climate, obviously, is a global problem, so we all need to be in it together. I think that's very clear, but we're also in a moment where the United States, for example, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, has chosen to very aggressively invest through an incentives-based approach in clean technologies, and that's great. We should celebrate that because, you know, the U.S. is finally in the game, and we're now within striking distance of our NDC, which is fantastic. So that should be celebrated, you know, as we think about what's needed to get to net zero. But what we also don't want to see happen is, you know, that ends up contributing to a sort of global subsidy race to the bottom, and that, you know, folks kind of retreat to their corners. So we definitely need to continue through diplomatic channels, through economic channels, others, figure out how we work with allies I like to think about a term that Secretary Granholm actually coined called co-opetition, right? Where we need to compete in some realms and we need to cooperate in others. And I think there are examples where cooperation is happening. One thing that was agreed upon actually a couple of years ago between the US and Europe is an agreement to basically reduce tariffs on low carbon steel and aluminum. We're still working out with Europe how actually we want to implement that. Europe has a very different, policy scheme than we do, including the emissions trading system that they have over there. We don't have anything like a carbon price or a cap and trade system, but we can definitely align on, things like shared performance standards to actually implement that cooperative agreement. So there are definitely things that we should cooperate on. Critical minerals is another example where we can't afford not to have allies and friends.
It's not lost. You all have a copy of FP. The issue of deglobalization, regionalization, the geopolitical tensions around that are everywhere, I think. John, how is this playing out in the nuclear space with some of the challenges around the geopolitical backdrop? There is also a lot of momentum. Now we're talking about climate and energy security in the same sentence, which I have to think has been a big change for nuclear.
Yeah, there are a number of things that have really driven us to where we are with nuclear and the increased interest. Certainly the Russian assault on Ukraine has been the most recent thing that's really focused countries on the importance of energy security and reliable energy partners. So that's leading to the interest you're seeing in places like Poland, Romania, and beyond in working with U.S. nuclear companies. Before that, it was really the climate imperative and the drive to decarbonize. And we've gone in the nuclear sector over the last half a dozen years from a conversation around how are we going to keep from shutting down well-run nuclear plants for economic reasons to how are we going to get to building more at the pace we're going to need them. That's been driven by both the carbon imperative and the commitments that have been made either by states or by utilities to decarbonize, the interest their customers have in decarbonizing their energy supply. But it's also been driven by the recognition that you need something that's firm and clean or dispatchable and clean to complement rising shares of things like wind and solar that we're going to build a lot more of, but need to be complemented with something that will ultimately keep the overall cost of the system down and reliability up as we decarbonize.
Just quickly before we move on, are we past the point where there's a public relations problem with nuclear? Or is it still not in my backyard?
So every survey you see support for nuclear going up. What matters at the end of the day when it comes to building and operating nuclear plants is what does that local support look like? And what we find in our survey research and that done by others is the support for nuclear energy is strongest in the communities that have it. And so if you look at where new nuclear has been built, the plants in Georgia, for example, the proposals to build in Wyoming or Idaho and beyond, those are all places that are either familiar with nuclear or they're familiar with energy, and the lack of public support is not a problem in those places. We enjoy very strong support.
Lisa, you mentioned this is an area that has to have an element of government and private cooperation. I think that's comes up again and again anytime we're talking about climate or SDGs. In some cases, these are longer-term projects. Is there enough interest from the private sector? What's the discussion with the private sector to pull those funds in? Because it can't just be government alone. What are you seeing? What's happening on that front?
Well, certainly when boards are making decisions on capital allocations, because they are oftentimes in a number of different countries, what they want to take a look at is what kind of investment tax credits they're going to get, whether or not there's some kind of PPA available to them to decrease the production costs. I mean, it does come down to hard numbers and what's most beneficial for the deployment of their capital. But I also think it's important to remember where the investment is happening as well. So something in Canada like a pretty clean grid already in terms of electricity production through nuclear, through hydroelectricity, and through abated natural gas can be something that's taken into consideration as well. And certainly that's what you're going to see our country here in Canada trying to put out in the window. So it's a combination of hard dollars as well as an appropriate environment for the renewables or for the project that's happening. And then the last piece that I think is important as well is governments have to demonstrate that when it comes time for these massive projects to be constructed, that they can actually get constructed in a timely fashion. Because if you have a time-limited tax credit or you have a time-limited PPA, if 3/4 of your time is eaten up getting permitting and going through community consultations before you can actually get a shovel in the ground, then it's all for naught. You really do have to make sure that all of the pieces work together: the processing, the permitting, the construction, as well as the decisions around whether or not to deploy your capital in a certain area.
I see heads nodding all around. Both of you respond to that. Robin, how much of a challenge is that?
Well, incredibly well said, Lisa. It's a huge challenge. I mean, we were actually in the green room just now talking about nuclear. If you look at what's needed to, finance nuclear, you need all of these different components to come together, right? You need a utility that's willing to do the project. You need a technology provider. You need, of course, the capital that's willing to invest in the project. You need an off-taker, ideally many off-takers. You likely need government dollars, at least for the initial demonstration and early deployments to de-risk the technology. So it is really complex, not to mention, some of the siting and permitting issues that, we undoubtedly need to resolve in the United States. Thankfully, nuclear isn't particularly susceptible to those, but it is something that affects things like transmission lines, for example. And of course, you also have things like, do we have the workforce we need in order to deploy all these technologies? Do we have people that are trained, especially in the mid-skill professions, that are capable of doing steel welding, pipe fitting, all the things that are really important to getting these projects built on time and on budget. So all of these things are definitely things that we need to be very attentive to. Thankfully, there's policy support now where it will help unlock some of those bottlenecks and barriers. But some of those things that I mentioned, like siting and permitting, are still things that are working their way through the legislative process here.
I'm so glad you brought up the issue of talent, because it's often left behind. We often focus on the issue of permitting and the political will. We know people love to talk about shovel ready, but this is another aspect of this that you don't just flip a switch. How severe is the talent shortage when we're talking about clean energy? I know you can speak to this, John, because I hear this all the time with nuclear. But how widespread is this?
Yeah, I don't have hard stats
just
off the top of my head,
but anecdotally.
Anecdotally, we're hearing that it is a major challenge, right? We especially need, again, people in the mid-skill professions where these are projects that are going to be built all around the country. Thankfully, there are some areas where there's actually a pretty good skill fit. If you look at, for oil and gas jobs, for example, people that drill wells are actually very well suited to work on geothermal projects, for example. There's a close to one-to-one skill match there. We're also seeing with nuclear, and John can speak to this, for folks in communities where there's a retiring coal facility. Those are people who are actually very excited to work at nuclear facilities. This is something that we've seen in, TerraPower is one of the advanced nuclear companies that's hoping to deploy its first project in Kemmerer, Wyoming. That community is really enthusiastic. So there is also a, sort of energy transition angle to the jobs piece as well, but definitely something that, we need to be very attentive to.
Which I think would pull in government support. And again, more money when you're talking about training as part of it. That's just another incentive for that public-private partnership. Yeah. John, I know talent's an issue with nuclear because we haven't been in the nuclear business in some places in a long time.
It is, and so workforce challenges have been part of what I'd say is the near-term struggle that we're facing. It's absolutely surmountable. To Robin's point, for example, at closing down coal plants, once you get beyond the nuclear island, a coal plant and a nuclear plant look a lot alike. And so our CEO talks about how she used to bring, when she was running a nuclear plant, she would bring the coal plant workers down to do the maintenance on the nuclear plant, on the steam supply side when things were shut down. So that's going to work, and that's got communities very excited. The other thing, the reason I've got some confidence that we'll be able to get past this is, the bulk of the people that are going to be required at these plants, are actually going to come through, whether it's the military. We get a lot of folks in the Navy, a lot of folks from organized labor, a lot of folks from who go through like community college type of programs. And because nuclear jobs are far and away the highest paying in the electric sector, and because the jobs are so long-lasting, and for those people working at a plant, they tend to be, in a place where you can actually put down roots. We actually, when it comes to a competition for clean energy workers, we do pretty well.
Lisa, I'd say that we were talking about the geopolitical tensions. In the last year or so, I do a lot of financial reporting. I talk to fund managers, investors all the time. There was a clear backlash against ESG investing with the concerns about energy shortages, maybe concerns about how legitimate the funds were. What are you seeing in real time? I feel like there's a sort of Twitter conversation happening, and then there's what's happening on the ground. How are ESG investment interests and flows affecting projects? Are you seeing more money? Are you seeing more skepticism? What's the state of play there on that side?
Right. So I would say that there's a lot more optimism about ESG as something by which to measure investment than there is negativity. I don't think this is something that's going to go away. For those who may wish it was going to go away, it certainly is not. Governments have committed to this, and they're putting in public policy levers that reflect such. And I think the larger financial institutions understand that and have embedded ESG into their own practices. And that means it's going to trickle out to customers and clients as well, where they'll be measured and they'll be asked about what kind of priorities and what kind of processes they have in there. Now, getting down to the nuts and bolts, are we going to be measuring on scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? I think that's far in the distance. But the concept of ESG as being important in terms of investing, in terms of what your book of investments look like and where you want to deploy your capital, I think that's here to stay. And people have definitely bought in is such a bad term, but people understand the imperative of reducing emissions of CO2 in the world. And as a result, we are pivoting in that direction.
Before I ask Robin a question, Claire, if there are any questions, just let us know. We'll bring them into the conversation right now. So feel free to, if you have one, we'll certainly take it. I'd like to try not to wait till the very end so we hear from all of you.
Wonderful. So just following up on the conversation about workforce, Alyssa at the State Department was wondering if you have any suggestions for less developed nations as they try to transition their workforces away from fossil fuels toward cleaner energy?
Great question. Would either of you like to take that?
Yeah, well, certainly I think that's something that our State Department has shown some real interest in, and is developing some programs, particularly in the nuclear space, to try to help other countries build up their capabilities. So I think there are resources available. I would encourage folks to take a look at what State has to offer in that space, and certainly reach out to me if you need some help finding the right folks.
Thing to add, other than, there's a huge amount that we can do through diplomatic channels, also through our international development programs, to think about what a more full spectrum approach looks like, not just investing in the projects in these places, but also potentially the people. So agree with John on that front.
Robin, you cover the entire scope of policy around clean energy. We were talking about nuclear. Where is some of the excitement? Whenever you're talking about private sector capital, they always want to know what's going to work soon, and when can I get a return on my capital? What are you seeing that's exciting? Where are flows moving that we need to pay attention to?
Sure. Well, huge excitement, certainly all the more so now because we've had 3 bills pass in the last 18 months that will make significant investments in a range of clean technologies in the United States. So in 2021, we had the passage of the infrastructure bill. And then last year, we had both the CHIPS and Science bill, which has about $11 billion in authorized R&D at the Department of Energy, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. So you put all those things together, it's about $500 billion of public investment going into clean technology, that will mobilize a huge amount of private capital. Some of that private capital, of course, is still waiting on the sidelines to see what comes out in the tax credit guidance through the Treasury Department. I know they're moving expeditiously to try and get that guidance out quickly so that capital can flow. But no doubt that this is a transformative moment for clean technology investment. In terms of what we're seeing, so we're a little bit of an interesting organization. For those of you who don't know us as well, we were founded by Bill Gates in 2016 to really work on, solving for what we saw the fundamental problems were with the Clean Tech 1.0 experience, right? Where you saw that there were kind of two fundamental problems. One is there's no natural market for low carbon products, right? In a lot of cases, we're talking about things that are still much more expensive, where the incumbent technology works very well. So that's a fundamental problem. And of course, there's an externality that needs to be dealt with in carbon emissions through policy. So that's, problem number one. Problem number two is if you're talking about hard tech, we're, talking about really long development cycles for the technology, often high capex, and it's a highly regulated market, right? So the things that we, have seen in the venture model in terms of the unicorns that have happened mostly in the digital space really aren't applicable to hard tech. So we got started to really think about how do you bring together technology, policy, and markets in more of a coherent, unified strategy. So I work on the policy side of the organization, but do spend a lot of time with our venture fund, with our project finance initiative. And what we're seeing is there is a ton of interesting talent going into the space, right? Lots of people that want to start companies, everything from alternative proteins to long duration energy storage, carbon removal. So a plethora of really cool things coming down the pipeline. And there's, of course, increasing private sector interests, through commercial lenders, et cetera, in actually putting money into companies and projects. So we're doing some of that ourselves, but also working with the broader ecosystem to get some of these things deployed. We've now got 100 companies in the venture portfolio, which is crazy, really, really cool. But we're only one, part of the broader ecosystem. There's so much more going on. It's really exciting.
Yeah, Lisa, I saw you shaking your head. That is a challenge, isn't it? Because when you hear clean tech, you're very excited, but then you do have those people who are looking for the unicorn and maybe coming at it through a tech lens. And it is a bit more complicated than that, isn't it?
It really is. And what I was nodding at is the fact that it's such a long tail in terms of how much time is going to have to go into before you get to the point where that tech is there. And that's really tough on planning. So I'll give you an example. It would be fantastic if hydrogen could take over tomorrow. But the reality is hydrogen is going to take a long time. And it'd be great if we could deploy, 1,000 megawatt nuclear on the turn of a dime. But it's not. It's going to take a long period of time for that to happen. And I think where we may be faltering in terms of the whole transition piece is I think we're optimistic on how much time it's going to take for us to really turn this gigantic vessel. And we're up against a real climate imperative of reducing emissions. So it's an exciting time. I'd love to see unicorns, and let's put all kinds of bets on this technology. And hopefully some of it will come to fruition earlier on the timeline than normal.
And again, this is why you need that partnership, not only, I think, interestingly, with public-private, but also with intermediaries who sort of bridge those two, who have patient capital, as patient as it can be right now. Claire, any other questions we should field as we start to?
Yeah, absolutely. We have one from Ulrich Trotz here in DC. He's asking, are there any plans for micronuclear pilot projects for the U.S., and are they considered to be part of the energy transition plan? And if so, what does the supply chain look like in the short term, mainly for uranium?
The answers are yes, yes, and it's coming along. Okay. There are several microreactor demonstrations scheduled for the U.S., a few at the Idaho National Laboratory where I used to work, but others in the U.S. as well. That's one of the, to your earlier question, that's one of the areas of generating some real excitement in the nuclear space. Part of it is tied into what I think is a really emerging opportunity, which is the use of nuclear to help decarbonize non-electric energy uses. This fairly recent announcement between X-Energy, a nuclear developer, and Dow Chemical, I think is just the tip of the iceberg of what you're going to see in terms of oil, chemical, and other companies seeking to decarbonize their own products, investing in nuclear and using nuclear to help bring down the carbon intensity of what they put out in the market.
For those who
Could I add something? Sorry, just a little commercial here. If you're talking about uranium supply chain, remember Canada to the north. We have a lot of uranium, and we're more than happy to send it down to the United States. We're a trusted partner.
Hear, hear.
For those who may not be familiar, microreactor?
Yeah, they tend to be single-digit, maybe low double-digit megawatts, as opposed to the 1,000-megawatt-ish reactors that we have most places around the world, in the few hundred megawatts of most small modular reactor designs. So
I get it, small modular reactor. We receive a lot of questions from investors on this because I think, and correct us if we're wrong, that the idea is that they are quicker, right? Just easier, smaller to build, don't have the tail that Lisa talked about, can be deployed everywhere, might be a game changer or move the needle more quickly. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and it's factory construction, so you're just doing assembly on site for the most part. Smaller additions of capacity, so it's not as big a price tag, and ultimately easier to permit and construct and bring it to operation, and more flexible too, and work with renewables.
Is there a risk that the interest in that moves away? Do we also need the longer-term, bigger projects?
We do, and that's actually what you're seeing, interest in Europe and Southeast Asia and other parts of the world where they still need those big chunks of capacity to come in. They're looking at the large water-cooled reactors that we use here in the U.S.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We are just about out of time, but I would like to thank you all. This is such an important conversation, and as you can see, you can't leave the money out of the conversation, but whenever you talk about the money in this space, it has to go hand in hand with policy, with an understanding of technology, and with an understanding of training, and I think that the three of you made that abundantly clear. But as Robbie said, we still need more. So hopefully having all of you work on it will help us get there. So thank you all, not only for participating in the panel, but for all the work that you do in this area.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.